Everyone thinks they're humble. That's the problem. Ask 100 people if they struggle with pride, and 99 of them will say yes. And then immediately start explaining why their particular version of it is different, why it's justified, why it's really just confidence or standards or being realistic about your own worth. The one sin everyone admits to in theory and almost no one admits to specifically. And it's not because people are lying, it's because pride is the only sin that comes pre-equipped with a defense attorney. The moment you start to see it clearly, it argues its own case. It presents evidence. It calls witnesses. It is very good at winning. That's what this week's lesson is about. It's called Pride versus Humility. And the memory text is Luke 14:11. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That's not advice. That's the law of gravity for the soul. It describes how the universe actually operates. Ignore it, and you don't escape the consequences. You just delay them. So this week, we're going to look at where pride begins, what it costs, and what the cure actually looks like. Not the version where you try harder to be humble, the version that actually works. Sunday, the tight fingers of pride. Pride didn't begin in a slum. It didn't begin in a prison cell, a back alley, or anywhere you'd normally associate with something going wrong. It began in a throne room, in the presence of God, surrounded by glory, in a being who had more than any creature in the universe had ever had, and decided it wasn't enough. Lucifer, the covering cherub, the most gloriously created being in existence, and somewhere inside all that beauty, something shifted, not suddenly, slowly, the way ice forms, layer by layer, imperceptibly, until the whole surface is changed and you never noticed exactly when. Isaiah 14:13-14 records what that shift sounded like when it finally spoke out loud. 5 sentences, 5 declarations, and every single one begins the same way. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the congregation. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. 5 times. I will. Count how many times God's will enters the picture. 0. God appears in the speech exactly once, as a position to be taken, as a height to surpass, not as creator, not as father, not as the source of everything Lucifer had ever been. Just as the next rung on a ladder already being climbed inside his own mind. That's what the lesson means when it says pride began with Lucifer, not the dramatic rebellion. Before that, the moment when self became the organizing principle of a life. The moment when what you have stops being a gift and starts being a baseline, and you begin calculating what you're still owed on top of it. Now put that next to Philippians 2. Paul describing Jesus, who being in the form of God, same starting point as Lucifer, clothed in divine glory, didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. Same position, opposite response. Lucifer reached up, Jesus reached down. Lucifer said, I will ascend. Jesus descended. Lucifer wanted to occupy a throne. Jesus emptied one. 2 trajectories, 1 origin. And the entire story of Scripture is the record of those 2 trajectories playing out across time. Now the lesson brings us to 1 John 2:15-17. John lists 3 categories: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And here's what's worth slowing down for. The first 2 categories are at least visible. Lust of the flesh, you feel it. Lust of the eyes, you see it. You know when those things are pulling at you. There's at least some awareness they're there. But the pride of life is different. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a temptation. It feels like a perspective. It feels like clarity. It feels like being realistic about your own value while the people around you are too modest to acknowledge theirs. That's why the lesson calls it something that cannot and should not be relied upon. It distorts what you see. It gives you information about yourself that isn't accurate and convinces you it's the most accurate information you've ever had. And here's the line the lesson draws carefully. Appreciating your gifts, not pride. Pursuing excellence, not pride. Feeling the weight of your calling, not pride. The line is here. Where is the credit going? When you say, God gave me this and I'm grateful, that's worship. When you quietly remove the first 4 words of that sentence and only keep the rest, I have this, that's where pride begins. Stewardship becoming ownership. Gift becoming property. You didn't earn your intellect. You didn't choose your capacity. You didn't work for the talents that were deposited in you before you had any say in the matter. And the moment you forget that, you are 5 words away from sounding exactly like Lucifer in Isaiah 14. Monday, know yourself. Jesus told a story about 2 men who went to pray. One was a Pharisee. In the religious world of his day, Pharisees were the standard. They studied the scriptures with obsessive precision. They followed the law in ways most people couldn't maintain. They were respected, recognized, and genuinely believed they had figured out what it meant to be right with God. This man stands at the front of the room, visible to the whole congregation, and prays. And the prayer goes like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of everything I own. Read that and ask, who is this prayer actually for? Not God. God doesn't need a status report. God doesn't need to be updated on this man's fasting schedule. The prayer is for the audience close enough to hear it, and maybe most of all, for the man himself. Because pride doesn't only need to be seen by others, it needs to be seen by the one who carries it. It rehearses its own resume constantly to stay convinced. The second man is a tax collector. In first-century Jewish culture, that carried a specific meaning. He worked for Rome, the occupying power. He collected money from his own people for the empire that was oppressing them. Families wouldn't eat with him. The synagogue barely tolerated him. He had no resume to present, no standing to appeal to. He stands at the back of the room, can't even lift his eyes toward heaven. He beats his chest. In that culture, a physical gesture of grief and shame. And he says 7 words, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That is the whole prayer. No comparison, no explanation, no list. Just the raw truth about his condition and a desperate ask for the one thing he needs. And Jesus says, this man went home justified, not the other one, this one. The lesson calls it the upside-down kingdom. By every human calculation, the Pharisee should have walked out right with God. He had the credentials. He did the work. He showed up. By every visible measure, he was winning. But he walked out empty because he walked in full of himself. And God cannot fill what is already occupied. The lesson puts it plainly. It is only he who knows himself to be a sinner that Christ can save, not the most righteous, the most honest. Righteousness isn't the entry requirement to grace. Honesty about your condition is. And pride is specifically designed to prevent that honesty. It is the mechanism that blocks the self-knowledge that confession requires, which is why 1 Peter 5:5 says what it says without softening it. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble, not overlooks the proud, not is disappointed by the proud, resists. The proud and God are moving in opposite directions, and the person moving in the wrong direction is the one who believes most confidently that he's exactly where he should be. Here's what the lesson points toward for the cure. You don't find true self-knowledge through introspection alone. You find it by beholding Christ. It is ignorance of him that makes men so uplifted in their own righteousness. When you see his purity clearly, your own condition becomes clear by contrast, not through shame, through light. The way you don't notice how dirty a window is until you stand in the sunlight and look through it. Tuesday, Moses, humble servant. If you were making a case for someone having every reason to be proud, Moses would be your strongest argument. Acts 7:22 says he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, mighty in words and deeds. He grew up in Pharaoh's household, not as a visitor, as royalty. He had access to the finest education, the most powerful connections, and the clearest path to influence the ancient world offered. The lesson describes him as historian, poet, philosopher, general of armies, legislator, without equal, and the world was before him. Hebrews 11:24-26 tells us what he did with it. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He refused, deliberately, with the full weight of what he was walking away from in clear view. He chose suffering with God's people over the passing pleasures of a life the world would have envied. That's remarkable on its own. But the lesson wants us to see what happened next, because Moses didn't walk from the palace directly into greatness. He walked into failure first. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave and killed the Egyptian. He believed, Acts 7:25 tells us, that his people would understand that God was delivering them through him. They didn't. Word reached Pharaoh. Moses ran. And the man positioned for power in the greatest empire of the ancient world ended up in the desert of Midian, herding sheep for 40 years. Let that number actually register. At 40, Moses was powerful, educated, recognized, moving in the rooms where history gets made. By 80, he was anonymous, a shepherd in the wilderness, the kind of person you wouldn't look twice at. He went from the palace to the pasture, from commanding armies to counting sheep, from a name that carried weight to a name nobody remembered. And the lesson wants us to hold this carefully. That wasn't a detour. That was the curriculum. What the desert stripped away wasn't Moses' capability. It stripped away his confidence in his own sufficiency. The man who had charged in and acted alone, certain he was the instrument of deliverance. That version of Moses couldn't have led a nation. He would have led a conquest. He would have led a demonstration. He would have led whatever narrative his pride constructed around itself. The Moses who came out of the wilderness was rebuilt. When God speaks to him at the burning bush, Moses doesn't say, "I've been waiting for this." He says, "Who am I that I should go? Who am I?" The man who once operated on pure self-confidence now isn't certain he's qualified to deliver a message. And that uncertainty, that genuine doubt about his own sufficiency, is exactly what made him ready. Numbers 12:3 gives us the summary. Now, the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. The humblest person alive, not a personality type. Moses wasn't born mild-mannered. He killed a man with his bare hands. Humility wasn't his default. It was a character built in him through obscurity, through failure, through 40 years of being nobody, while the clock of his calling kept running without him knowing it. The lesson asks whether someone describing you would use the word humble. That's uncomfortable because most of us would rather earn other words. Capable, respected, effective. Humble doesn't make the resume. The world has no ceremony for it, but God does, and the lesson is clear. You cannot manufacture it yourself. You cannot decide to be humble the way you decide to work harder. It's not a discipline you choose, it's a death, a slow dying of the self-sufficient version of yourself, and a rebuilding by hands that aren't yours. The desert wasn't where Moses waited. It was where Moses was made. Let me pause here for a moment. Everything you're seeing on this channel, the research, the preparation, the time it takes, exists because people who believe in this work make it possible. If these lessons have helped you in your walk with God, consider becoming a member. It keeps this free and accessible to everyone. To those already supporting, thank you. That's not a small thing. Let's keep going. Wednesday, the greatest offense. It's the night before the cross. Jesus has just taken bread and broken it, poured wine and passed it, told the men at that table that his body would be broken, his blood poured out, that he would be handed over, that everything is about to change. This is the most sacred night in the history of the world. God is hours from dying. The weight in that room should be unbearable. And the disciples begin arguing about which of them is the greatest. Luke 22:24. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. Read that again. The bread is still on the table. The cup is still in their hands. The gravity of what Jesus just said is still in the air. And they're competing for a rank. Your first instinct might be to distance yourself from them, but the lesson wants you to stop and notice something. These men weren't shallow. They weren't uninformed. They had walked with Jesus for 3 years, heard every teaching, watched every miracle. They knew what he said about the last being first, about greatness looking like a child, about the servant being the one who leads. 3 years of the best teaching anyone had ever heard, and pride still got in. That should make anyone who thinks they're immune very, very careful, because the assumption that you would have handled it differently, that's the Pharisee's prayer wearing a different outfit. Jesus doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't rebuke them. He does something more permanent. He redefines the word they're fighting over. Luke 22:25-27. The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. And then, yet I am among you as the one who serves. Pause on that sentence. The creator of everything visible and invisible, the one whose word holds matter in existence, the one before whom Isaiah fell as a dead man at that table on that night, saying, I am here as the one who serves, not as a lesson in good manners, not as a demonstration to be admired, as a revelation of who God actually is. Serving isn't something God does occasionally to make a point. It's the nature of the Trinity. The direction of heaven is always outward. The Father gives the Son gives His life, the Spirit gives His presence. Everything flows out, not in. Pride is the exact opposite. It moves inward, it accumulates, it protects, it keeps score. It asks, "What am I getting from this?" And the lesson says, slowly, so it lands, that there is nothing so offensive to God or so dangerous to the human soul as pride and self-sufficiency. Of all sins, it is the most hopeless, the most incurable, not the sins that make headlines. Pride. Because every other sin you can name, bring to God and confess. But pride is the sin that uses your own perception against you. It tells you that you don't have it. And a disease you don't believe you have is a disease you will never seek treatment for. The longer you go without treatment, the more convinced you become that you're fine. The disciples at that table had every resource they needed to be free of pride, and they still struggled with it on the night before the crucifixion. If that doesn't put us on our knees, nothing will. Thursday, look at Him. Philippians 2, 3-8. The heart of everything this week builds toward. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind. Let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interests of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Let this mind be in you, not study it, not admire it from a distance. In you, and then Paul traces the movement. It's a staircase going down. Every step chosen, nobody forced it. Jesus selected every step deliberately. Being in the form of God, He didn't consider equality with God something to hold on to. Made Himself of no reputation, took the form of a servant, came in the likeness of men, humbled Himself, became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross, step by step, lower, lower, lower. And at the bottom of those steps, the cross, which in Rome wasn't merely an execution method. It was a social statement about a person's worth. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves and criminals. Roman citizens couldn't legally be crucified. It was considered too degrading even for them. The King of the universe chose it, not because He had to, because that's where love went when it had no floor. Now look at what the lesson calls us to in response. Spend time looking at Him, not analyzing, not taking notes, looking. Because the lesson understands something crucial. You cannot argue yourself out of pride. You cannot discipline your way to humility. Trying harder to be humble is just another project for the ego. And the ego is extremely skilled at hijacking projects. Look how humble I've become. That's pride in a new costume. The real transformation doesn't come from effort. It comes from exposure, from beholding something so much larger than yourself that the constant internal calculation of your own importance begins to feel absurd. When you look at the cross long enough, when the image of the one who made galaxies, choosing a criminal's death for you, actually has time to settle into your soul, the thought, "I deserve more," loses its grip. Not because you suppressed it, because something displaced it. The lesson says it directly. When we look to Him, everything else, especially ourselves and our own perceived greatness, pales into complete insignificance. Self disappears when you look at Him, not because you worked on it, because there's no room for it when you're genuinely absorbed in what He did. That's not self-improvement, that's transformation. And it starts with looking. Friday. The lesson closes with something that should settle slowly. The nearer we come to Jesus, And the more clearly we discern the purity of his character, the more clearly we shall discern the exceeding sinfulness of sin, and the less we shall feel like exalting ourselves. Those whom heaven recognizes as holy ones are the last to parade their own goodness. The holiest people are the quietest about it, not performing modesty, not managing appearances. They genuinely don't see themselves as impressive because they've spent enough time in the light to know what the light reveals. And what the light reveals isn't a polished surface. It's a broken person who has been put back together by hands that aren't their own. The lesson makes a point that's easy to miss. What the disciples needed wasn't more instruction. They had 3 years of the finest teaching in human history. Information was not the gap. What they needed was a change of heart that brought them into harmony with the kingdom's principles. That change isn't something you engineer. It's something you position yourself for. You open the scripture. You look at Jesus. You kneel and say what the tax collector said, not as a religious performance, but as the actual truth about your condition. 7 words. And God, who gives grace to the humble, does what you can't. The lesson names what heaven actually values in a person: simplicity, self-forgetfulness, the confiding love of a child. Self-forgetfulness. That word is the opposite of everything pride produces. Pride is relentless self-monitoring. Am I being noticed? Am I getting the credit? Am I ahead or behind? Self-forgetfulness is the freedom of being so absorbed in someone larger than yourself that those questions stop running in the background. Not because you suppress them, because they were replaced. Let me bring this whole week together. Sunday showed us where pride begins, not in the lowest places, but in the highest, in the presence of God, in the heart of the most gloriously created being in existence. 5 declarations starting with, I will, not once considering God's will. That's the anatomy. Not hating God, making yourself the center. Monday gave us 2 men in a prayer meeting, one full of credentials, one full of nothing but honest need, and Jesus saying the empty one went home right with God. Because God fills what's open, and pride seals the container shut. Tuesday gave us Moses, a prince, a scholar, a man positioned for generational influence, who failed and spent 40 years in a wilderness being rebuilt. The most powerful man of his world, becoming the humblest person on the face of the earth. Not by temperament, by formation. Desert as classroom, obscurity as curriculum. Wednesday put us at the Last Supper, the most solemn night in history, and 12 men arguing about rank. And Jesus, who had every right to pull rank, redefining what rank means. I am among you as the one who serves. Not a lesson, a revelation of who God is. Thursday took us to Philippians 2, the staircase going down, every step chosen, the form of God becoming the form of a servant, the name above every name choosing the cross, and the call to let that same mind be in us, not by effort, but by beholding. Friday reminded us that the holiest people are the quietest about it, and that what we need isn't more instruction, it's a change of heart, one that begins with honestly seeing ourselves in the light of who He is. Here's what to carry. Pride is not just a character flaw, not just a rough edge. The lesson calls it the number one factor that keeps people from having a close relationship with God. Not doubt, not failure, not a crowded schedule. Pride. Because doubt can be honest. Failure can be confessed. A crowded schedule can be reorganized. But pride tells you none of those things are problems. And a problem you won't name is a problem you will not solve. So you do what the tax collector did. You stop looking sideways at the people around you. You stop comparing. You tell the truth. Just 7 words. God be merciful to me, a sinner. And you do what Thursday says. You look at the staircase going down. You look at the God who had every right to remain on the throne and chose the cross instead. You look until the thought, "I deserve more," starts sounding like the most absurd sentence you've ever formed. Luke 14:11. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Not a warning, a promise. And the person making it descended from heaven to a manger, to a cross, to a tomb, to prove he meant every word. The staircase goes down. Go down. God will handle up. He's better at it than you are. If this gave you something to take into your week, pass it along. Send it to someone in your group, someone you do life with, someone who might need this message right now. And if you have a moment, drop a comment below. Even one word helps more people find these videos than you'd think. We'll see you next week. Grace be with you.